The following podcast contains information and real stories about sexual assault and or violence which may be triggering to survivors.
From sporting
In the morning newspapers, a third allegation of sexual assault. By afternoon,
had to
a
fight to
fourth.
share her story of sexual abuse.
Bravery and the strength of Grace Tame.
Another
and
former
people like
staffer
her.
alleging the man had run his hand up her thigh in a
haven't seen
bar.
this process of child grooming.
After a rape allegation and a question-time sex scandal.
woman who bled heavily.
In 2016, the Australian Bureau of Statistics estimated that 1 in 6 women and 1 in 16 men have experienced some form of sexual crime since the age of 15. On top of that, most major studies indicate that 25% of young women between ages of 15 and 21 will experience some form of sexual crime within that 6-year time frame. This is far too high. In a time where the world is changing so fast, sexual crimes seem to be regularly dominating the news, which begs the question, why is this and how can we help prevent it? I'm your host, Byron, a 22-year-old podcaster from Sydney, Australia. Join me as I interview Brent, one of Australia's most respected communicators in the field of sexual crime, criminal profiling and personal safety in secondary schools and universities. He may have been to your school. Having spoken to over 900,000 students on the subject, this podcast aims to educate young people around the reality of sexual crimes and the severity of these crimes. Together, we explore the legal definitions as well as the ethical and moral, wrapping these up in metaphors and stories in an easy to listen to and easy to understand way. Welcome to this episode. All right, welcome back to the podcast. Today we're going to be talking about drunkenness. And the whole reason we kind of wanted to bring up this one is obviously it's a hot topic in this area of talk, but when I had you on my podcast, I brought up a question, which is a very common question you get asked. What if both people are drunk? What is the deal there? Because it's very grey, it's difficult, there's a lot of variables. And man, those videos went very viral. We're talking millions of views, not exaggerating, tens of thousands of comments. People were arguing, people were saying, oh, what about this? What about this? A lot of people loved the content and agreed with it and stuff. But it did highlight how much confusion young people face when it comes to if he was drunk, she was drunk, he said, she said, blah, blah, blah.
Yeah.
So what are you finding when it comes to drunkenness? What's the deal there?
Yeah, look, Byron, you're so right. It's one of the areas, and consent is a fairly contentious subject matter anyway. I mean, those that are listening and who have listened to our other podcasts on consent, it's quite multi-layered and what have you. But one of the biggest areas of contention is around the whole area of drunkenness. So here's how I approach it. Pretty much everybody knows, everyone listening into this podcast would know that somewhere in the law it says something like a drunk person can't consent. And it sort of does. The law states to consent you have to give permission or change your mind freely, without threats, force, violence. We've discussed that in an earlier podcast. Then the law looks at age. We've discussed that, age of consent, what it is, how that applies. The third pillar of consent law looks into the state of mind of the person providing consent. Now, the law states that to consent, you must be in a sober and rational state of mind at the time of providing consent. Rational is a legal term that refers to a person's intellectual capacity. Now, that's separate to the effects of drugs or alcohol. So let's put that aside. So let's come back to saying, okay, so the law states, and each state and territory in Australia and overseas as well, that when a person is consenting, giving permission for an intimate exchange, that is only consent if the person providing it is sober. Now, the way that gets interpreted by laymen is, okay, that means a drunk person can't consent, which is correct, but the law doesn't actually say that per se. Yeah. But look, it's not wrong.
But then you go into, well, what is drunk?
Well, exactly. And here's what happens. I speak to students, school students, university students, and say, can a drunk person consent? No, goodness me, definitely not. Fantastic. Next question, what does that mean? What is the test? Sort of generally crickets. People don't know, and that's understandable. The only time that drunkenness as a line is clear is if the line is 0. So one example of that is P-plate driving in Australia. When you're on your Ps, there is a 0 tolerance to alcohol.
Which, to clarify, is just when you've got your first stage of your license.
First stage of your license. You go 3 years on Ps. You do a year on red, 2 on green. Yeah. Now, while you're driving on your Ps, like a provisional driving license, you are not allowed to consume any alcohol prior to driving. So if a P-plate driver is pulled up by the police, and we've got lots of people listening in on their Ps, they'll tell you that when you get pulled up on your Ps, one of the first things the police usually do is they do a random breath test on the side of the road. which means they shove that little black box into the driver's side window. You have to count up to 10. They have a look at the box. If you have any alcohol on your breath, you've just lost your license as a P-plate driver. So it's a very tangible test because it's 0.
And it's great. Like, it works. From what
It
I've
does.
seen, all my mates are there. Oh, I'm driving.
Everyone's really aware of it. That's why we have designated drivers and all that type of thing. Okay. The problem is when we bring that terminology into consent, we don't have the 0 tolerance because the consent law doesn't say once a person has consumed 1 drink of alcohol, they can no longer consent.
Otherwise, everyone's committed the crime.
Exactly. So when we dig a bit deeper into the law, there's a bit of another clue. We peel the onion and say, okay, so a drunk person can't consent. A person who is affected by drugs or alcohol can't consent. What does that actually mean? Well, the law goes a step further and says this. Once a person is substantially affected by drugs or alcohol, consent cannot be given. So that's another term which gets people to go, right, okay. So you've got to be substantially affected by drugs or alcohol. Okay, but what does that mean?
Yeah.
So now we peel the onion further. Now, the law doesn't actually state what I'm going to say now, but this is the test which is applied to determine when somebody has become substantially affected. It's very much an observational test. So when you can see a person is substantially affected by drugs or alcohol, it's when you can see the person is, lacking in balance, slurring their speech, all those things that are
portrayed in the movies, very exaggerated.
All that stuff. Or anyone that goes to a party in the weekend can look around the lounge room at midnight and observe somebody possibly who is substantially affected by drugs or alcohol. So when I deliver this talk into, say, a schooling age group, what I say to them is this. If you're at a party this weekend with your friends and you're observing somebody at the party, and to your observation, you can tell by looking at them that they have been drinking a lot or taking drugs. Now, you may not know which. It doesn't matter under law. You haven't seen them drinking. You haven't seen how many drinks they've had. Even if you had, you don't know what they're drinking. What you can see, what you're observing, is a person whose balance is gone. If you went to speak to them, they're slurring their speech. Now, if we freeze that there, the law would take a position on this. And the law would say, if the person that you're observing is so affected by drugs or alcohol that any reasonable person observing them can see those effects, and a reasonable person would deem that because of those effects, this person is incapable of consent can't be given. So it's like an earlier podcast, Byron, I've said the term reasonable is a term that's used a lot through law. So what a courtroom, if we want to go to a courtroom or a judge, what a judge would basically say to a jury is you need to ask yourself, with all the evidence that you had, would a reasonable person observing this person that we're talking about in court deem that they are incapable of consent? So when I put that into, if you like, layman's terms, what I say to students, and I've said this to my own son and daughter, when they're older now, but if you're standing in front of somebody who's had so much to drink or enough drugs that you can tell by looking at them, morally, ethically, legally, you step back from that. Yeah. Because in essence, what I would say is it's like you've got a little copper or lawyer sitting on your shoulder.
The devil
saying,
and the angels.
Saying, just stop here and ask yourself this. Would a reasonable, decent, moral person looking at the state of this person in front of me deem that they're capable of consent? Remember, the law says if that person is substantially affected by drugs or alcohol, consent cannot be given. Well, the law would also say, I believe, that once you can see clearly effects of alcohol of a person who's drunk or drug affected, they have become substantially affected, right?
Which is one of the pillars you mentioned.
It is. So the other way we can look at this, and to some of your folks listening in here who may be a little older, 18 plus, many of them will have done the responsible service of alcohol test, because you have to have that to get a job in a licensed premises. Yeah. So a lot of the young people listening in who may be at uni or your age and what have you, you want to get a job in a pub, even restaurants that serve alcohol and things, you've got to have done the RSA. Some of the younger folks listening may have heard of it but don't quite know what it is. Now, the RSA test is the responsible service of alcohol test. You do it online. You get a little sort of like credit card type thing.
And then when you go to other countries, you have to resit it for their...
All that sort of thing. So you go for a job up, where are we here? We're down in Miranda. You go for a job at a pub up the road. To get employed, if you're working in a licensed premise, you have to show you've done that. Now, the responsible service of alcohol test, in essence, is an observational test that you apply to determine whether somebody can legally be served alcohol. So a lot of young people listening in will have said, okay, so so this is what's happening when you line up outside a pub and the person on the door checks your ID, then they have a chat to you, don't they? And what do they ask you?
Yeah, how many drinks have you had?
How many drinks have you had? Where have you been tonight? Oh, my friends. Have you been drinking? Yeah, a little bit. What have you been drinking? How many drinks have you had? What they're doing is they're actually applying the responsible service of alcohol test, because under law, they can't let you into a licensed premises, which they're standing at the front of, if you fail that test. Now, how do you fail the responsible service of alcohol test? It's when you are clearly showing the effects of alcohol. So can you start to see a comparison here to consent law?
Yes.
Okay. So if you turn up at a pub, you've had 1 or 2 drinks, but the friend that you're with has had a lot and they're swaying and slurring their speech, will they be allowed in?
No.
No. And lots of people listening in will connect to this because they go, oh yeah, I've been at a pub where my friend that was with me was swaying, slurring their speech, and the guy on the door, the girl on the door said, well, look, you can come in, but unfortunately we can't let your friend in. Why not? Because they failed the responsible service of alcohol test.
It's happened a lot when I've been out with parties and stuff, people who fall asleep in a club. If you fall asleep, you're gone. They'll kick you out.
You're gone, and because of the same thing. So another way to look at it is we've got folks listening into this podcast who work behind the bar, and they'll tell you, many of them, that they have actually refused somebody's service.
For sure.
Because of that. So somebody walks up to the bar exhibiting clearly the effects of drugs or alcohol. That bar person legally can't serve them more alcohol. If they do, they can lose their job, and the licensed premises can lose their license.
Which happened last year, I think.
Oh, it happens all the time.
There was they served a guy who's obviously too drunk. He had 19 beers. He got served. Served 19 beers. Yeah. Then drove, killed himself.
So where does this go with consent law? Well, when I do my university lectures, I say to them, if a person has failed the responsible service of alcohol test, that same person will have failed the test of consent.
Yes.
So there's the link, there's the connection. Because, and interestingly, one of the talks I did some years ago at a regional university in New South Wales, a guy came and sat in who was the head of the sex crimes unit in that area. And I had a chat to him afterwards. And he said, sadly, each year he has to send detectives to the university to investigate sexual assault, sexual crimes. And he said almost without exception, they are sexual crimes where there is major issues with regards to a person's capacity to consent due to the effects of alcohol or drugs. He said the last thing these detectives hear from me as they walk out to go up to start the investigation is, remember to apply the responsible service of alcohol test to the person who has raised this complaint. If they failed that, we need to look at this. That's where the investigation starts. So what we keep coming back to is this. The law says to consent, you've got to be sober. The law says once a person is substantially affected by alcohol, consent cannot be given, or drugs. The way for people listening to this podcast to apply that, in my view, would be to carry with them an understanding that once somebody is visibly affected by drugs or alcohol, morally, ethically, and legally, there's a massive question mark over their capacity to consent. And the more affected they are, so we get to a point where someone's unconscious.
Yes.
Well, then it's black and white. We know that. But the test doesn't start when they're unconscious. The test doesn't start when they've had one drink.
Yeah.
The test starts when, under any reasonable observation, you can see the person is affected.
Slurring, swaying.
So the problem that I have with the whole discussion around drunkenness, Byron, is every person listening into this podcast has been told probably at school in PDHPE, a drunk person can't consent. Most haven't been given the information that we've just shared in the last 10 minutes. And for me, that's what's really important. No good just knowing the slogan, drunk person can't consent.
So to clarify, is drunk when you are beyond that point? Because I thought drunk was once you've had a few drinks.
Drunk is, well, again, drunkenness is not a term that's used under the law per se.
Yeah, it's
when a person, the law defines drunkenness for consent as being when a person is substantially affected by alcohol.
Yeah.
Now, how do you know when someone is substantially affected by alcohol? It's an observational test through the eyes of a reasonable person. So going back to my analogy before, young people listening into this at a party this weekend, look around the room later on in the party and look to see if, through your observation, anyone who is clearly affected by drugs or alcohol, the law would say these are people who, by definition, are incapable of consent.
And it could be you. We've all been there. If you're over 18 and you started drinking
Yeah.
for a while, there are going to be times where like, oh, that time I didn't even remember the night.
Yeah.
I almost passed out.
Well,
It's
clearly,
like-
at that point, you failed that
exactly.
test. You wouldn't be allowed in a licensed premises.
Exactly. Yeah.
And that's another way to look at it, when again, with the older, like university students or university age folks that are listening, it's you look around and say, would that person be allowed to leave this party and walk into a pub? No, they wouldn't get in. Why not? Well, they're drunk. Well,
There you go.
the law would say you have now established that they are substantially affected by it, so now we have an issue with their capacity to consent. Now, where this gets to, Byron, what if they've both been drinking?
Yeah. And just before we get into that,
sure.
I will say, obviously, this is not a foolproof thing because it's observational. Example, the other day, I was fully sober, went to go into a pub. The guy didn't let me in because I've got big pupils and he thought I was just like on drugs or something.
Right,
I
okay.
hadn't had a single drink. It was like
Yeah.
7:30. I was getting some dinner.
Yeah.
And so it's not perfect, right?
No, it's not.
Now, look,
It's not.
But there isn't really a perfect solution
Look,
unless
there-
we have
there-
technology that
there
links
isn't.
into us.
There isn't, but my view is this, mate, that as with other things that we've done in some of our podcasts, it's about providing the young people who are listening with tests that they can apply,
Yes.
which are effective and accurately reflect the law. So the test I would encourage people to have, if you like, metaphorically in their back pocket, if they're thinking, okay, this person I may be thinking about going down the back of the party with an intimate exchange with, what are they like? How are they presenting? They've had a couple of drinks, so have I. Yeah, but have they had so many that I can see that they're drunk? Could they get into a licensed premises? Could they drive a car if they were fully licensed in that state? Well, no way. Well, if they fail those, then morally, ethically, and legally, you've got to also be saying, well, okay, they're too drunk to reasonably know what they're doing in an intimate exchange.
Which now links us into, okay, we understand that, Brent, but what if she is really drunk, but I am also really drunk?
Two people have been drinking.
Yeah.
And this is the one that, when we had an earlier podcast, Byron, this caused a lot of consternation. Most people got it. Some strangely didn't. And that's okay. And I'll take the blame for that. I may have used an analogy which enabled people to sort of throw up some strange defences for this. Here's my take. Let's cut to the chase. When two people come together and they are both affected by alcohol, the law would state, or the law would recognise, that there is still a capacity for one to commit a crime against another. So that's the first point that I would make. When two people come together and have an intimate exchange, we could have a situation where, although they're both affected by alcohol, one may have committed an offence against another, and the law would recognise this. So let's look at it. Let's say two people at a party this weekend have both been drinking. They get together, and there's an intimate exchange between those two people in a bedroom. But one of the two people believes that intimate exchange was interacted when they were too drunk to offer consent. So then let's say that person then goes to the police to raise that, because the police can only be involved when they've been informed of an intimate exchange or informed of an issue, a legal issue. What the police will do at that point is they will speak to that person. And the job for the police at that early stage is to establish, is there a reasonable cause to suspect that this person may have been subjected to a crime or crimes? So they will listen to what that person tells them. And let's say that person says, I was at a party, I got quite drunk, I ended up in a bedroom at the party, and I woke up some hours later, and there was somebody in the room with me, in the bed with me. My clothes had been taken off, they were on the floor, and this person had been having intercourse with me. I know that because as I went to get out of bed, there were maybe used condoms in the bed, or the person actually intimated themselves, we've been having sex for the last couple of hours.
Yeah.
I can't remember
Because memory's fragmented.
getting into the room.
Right.
So this is what the police are hearing from this one person. So that establishes a reasonable cause to suspect. If we can investigate this and show that this person was in fact this drunk, well, we go back to the law that says if a person is so drunk they have no conscious memory of where they are or what's happened to them, are they capable of consent? No, they're not. Now, where the confusion comes up is people say, hang on, but what if the person who did it had also been drinking? And sometimes, respectfully, that question comes forward under the assumption that if the person's been drinking, there's no way they can be charged.
Yeah.
Like, drunkenness is a barrier to legal intervention.
A scapegoat.
It's not.
A get out of jail free card.
So the police investigation goes down the path. Now, let's say at the conclusion of it, we've identified person A and person B were in a room. Person B came to the police to claim that in that room something happened to them sexually when they were incapable of consent. Person B claims, well, yeah, that was me, but I'd been drinking as well. The job for the police at this point is to establish, do we have an offender and do we have a victim? Now, they establish that as a result of this investigation. Sometimes there's just not enough. And there's, in essence, when two people have been drinking come together, and let's say it's an intimate exchange, there are three likely outcomes of a police investigation. One could be the police deem that neither party, in their view or in their investigation, has committed a criminal offence. Nothing happens. Another conclusion could be both parties have in fact crossed the line here, but we're not going to look at pursuing it. The third could be we believe that the two people in the room, person A is the offender from our evidence, our investigation, person B is the victim. Now this question is, yeah, but what if person A has been drinking? Well, that doesn't stop the law from being applied.
A crime was still committed.
You can't use drunkenness as a defence for committing the law. Now, this is where people get confused, say, yeah, but hang on. The girl was drunk as well. Or the other person was drunk as well. Yes, but they've had a crime committed against them. So the analogy that I use, which caused some consternation, was it's like two people at a party who are both drunk and one physically assaults the other. The law would say, okay, we've got two drunk people, but one committed a crime, one had a crime committed against them. The job of the law, the investigation of the police, is to establish, do we have an offender and do we have a victim? Now, if an investigation gets to the point of saying, yes, we believe person A is the offender and person A is the victim, they've both been drinking, but we've identified one who's had a crime committed against them and one who committed it. The person who's the victim of the crime has every right to report it. The person who's the offender of the crime has no right to claim because they're drunk that they can't be charged. So coming back to this question, what if both people have been drinking? The law would say the law doesn't stop at the door of drunkenness. It opens it and it continues to be applied. Can it be difficult to establish when two people who have been drinking come together exactly what happened? Yeah, it can be difficult. That's why, as I said earlier, there may not be enough to establish that a crime has been committed. But in circumstances where the police believe two people in a room, we have identified person A as the offender and person B as the victim. The fact that they have both been drinking doesn't change the application of the legal process. So I'm hoping that our attempt this time to sort of say if they've both been drinking has given some clarity around that.
Well, just to clarify, because anyone who hasn't seen the TikTok or listened to other episode, which I actually will recommend listen to the other episode, it's kind of like this entire season in one episode on my podcast. But you mentioned the analogy, which was if you or I were drunk at a party and you came up and you just punched me in the face, I got a bruise on my face, you've clearly assaulted me. We were both drunk. Which means there's still clearly someone who assaulted me and I'm the victim. Because you're drunk, it doesn't justify what you've done.
No.
In translating that to a sexual assault crime, there's clearly someone who's initiated it and someone who's a victim. That's kind of what we were trying to get across with that message.
Yeah, look, we were, and the criticism that kept coming up from some, and it was only a minority, was, but you can't compare a physical assault to a sexual crime. I wasn't comparing the actions, I was comparing the application of the law.
As a metaphor, yeah.
I was using it as a metaphor because often the question is, but if both people have been drinking, does that mean the law doesn't apply? No. The law still applies. It may just be more difficult to apply it. And we could find that when two drunk people come together, they're both perhaps guilty of a crime. They're both have done things against each other which may cancel out the fact that the police may want to pursue it.
Yeah.
So it could be a situation where two drunk people at a party have a fight. It's not one assaulting another.
Yeah.
They're just two drunk people rolling around on the ground, sort of throwing punches and missing and stuff like that. Well, that's different to two drunk people coming together and one just punching the other one straight in the face.
That's a great metaphor there.
So, well, I don't know. We'll run with it, but we still may get people going, no, what if? But, just keep coming back to the principle. a lot of police investigations that will occur this weekend, wherever you live when you're listening to this podcast, will involve two people who have been drinking. And a lot of those police investigations will end up with one of them being charged of committing a crime against the other. The idea that because two people have been drinking, it changes the law with regards to how it's applied is not actually in sync with what happens.
Yeah. And I'll just say some points here, just on when it comes to ethical and moral. We've just deep dived into the law, a bunch of things.
Yeah.
But ethical and moral, we mentioned the responsible alcohol test, where you can test and see that. So much of it comes down to body language, how they're acting. Just like, honestly, you should be able to tell. They really shouldn't be. I think a lot of people will use drunk as an excuse to be like, I couldn't tell she was drunk because I was drunk too. It's like, no, I think you could tell. I very rarely in my life have I ever been so drunk I wasn't in control of what I was doing. I don't think I've actually ever entered that point.
And just on that too, Byron, if you're so drunk you have no idea what you're doing, how could you be capable of committing a sexual offence? So often the excuse doesn't match up to the capacity of the person. Also, can I say, and I don't want to go down a rabbit hole here, is when we're looking at determining a person who is too drunk to consent, that legal determination is made through the eyes of a sober, reasonable person. It's not made through the eyes of another drunk person. So in a courtroom environment, if I have been charged with having a sexual intimate interaction with somebody who was too drunk to consent, under law, you cannot claim as a defence, I was so drunk I didn't know what I was doing.
Of course not. Because otherwise you could just go commit any crime and justify it by saying you were drunk. Of course not. It doesn't make any sense.
Yeah. So hopefully we've allayed some of the... I thought last time we did this chat, Byron, that we were helping to eliminate the confusion. It seemed to for most, but some that needed a little bit more.
Look, when you get millions of views, it only takes a tiny percentage to speak up, and 20% of people make 80% of the noise, sort of thing, right?
Sure.
And so, hopefully we've had time to deep dive into this topic with more details.
Yeah.
Otherwise, I think, is there any final things around drunkenness?
I'll say this. I would estimate in the age group of young people listening to our podcast, over 90% of sexual crimes committed by or against people in that age group, there will be high levels of alcohol involved. Easy. Over 90%, probably 95%.
I would guess that too.
If you were to look at the recent surveys that came on the back of the Chanel Contos survey and things such as that, over 3,000 over a few days, huge percentage were young women who had been taken advantage of sexually while they were too drunk to be able to consent. So it's a topic that we do need to discuss, and it's one that for most people is fairly sort of black and white. So you've got to be careful of getting analysis paralysis around this and going around in ever-decreasing circles trying to prove sort of a strange point, to look at the 0.00001% and try to apply that to the other 99.999% of situations. The police deal with sexual crimes involving people who have both been consuming alcohol every week in Australia, any country in the world.
Of course,
It is the probably most common type of investigation that they run. So to them, it's not even an issue with regards to the application of the law. It can be an issue with regards to gathering enough evidence to prove an allegation. Yeah, but that's the same for a whole lot of offences. So just keep coming back, as you said, Byron, to the moral, ethical, because the legal is in line with it.
Yeah, absolutely.
The legal is in line with the moral and the ethical. If a person appears to be affected by drugs or alcohol, we have a person who, through that appearance, is incapable of providing reasonable consent. If you choose to interact intimately with that person, that is your choice, but there can be consequences, morally, ethically, and legally.
Yeah.
If you yourself have been drinking, well, that was your choice to drink. Yeah. So it's not a gender-based issue. It's an offender versus victim-based issue for a police investigation.
Absolutely. And to wrap it up, I know you agree with this, but we're not saying don't have fun. We're not saying don't do stuff while you're drunk. It's just be aware of all this stuff. Just by listening to this podcast, you're probably a bit more educated. And when you are at a party, maybe you'll be sitting there and you'll be having a look around the room and be like, she's definitely too drunk, he's too drunk. Blah. I just have analysing
you've
that
got to
sort of
look
stuff.
out for yourself. You've got to look out for your mates. You
Yeah.
know, if you see a friend of yours maybe trying to get a drunk person out of a lounge room to get them down to the back of a party, most of us listening, or most of you listening to this podcast, have been around long enough to know that type of scenario can end pretty ugly. It can end in tears. So, this information is also to remind you as a friend, as a bystander, hey, that doesn't look good. And I have had so many young people, guys and girls, who have told me that they have stepped in at that point where they've seen somebody. It might be a friend of theirs who was stepping in with someone who's drunk. It might have been their friend who was drunk. It could be male, it could be female. It doesn't matter. It's recognising, okay, I can see where that's heading. That person is really drunk. That person trying to get them outside, up the hallway into that room, their intentions I don't think are particularly honourable. Maybe we need to step up to the plate here and say, hey, come back over here with us. It's and of course, when we're looking at that, to assist us in making those choices, maybe some of the subject matter that we're discussing in this podcast can have that more front of mind for people.
Yeah, well, that's it. And I think, especially as young men, that is our responsibility to be calling out our friends in situations like that.
Yeah, sure.
I think when you do have a group of guys, you can be peer pressure and everything. But if you can, go in and stop it yourself, you could prevent something horrific from happening.
100%.
And I think that's what's really important. Because when people say, "Oh, men should be doing more," it's like, what do we do? That's what you can be doing.
Yeah, definitely.
Take responsibility for your mates.
Yeah.
Look around, and you can take action when you see stuff like that happening in environments.
Cool.
Awesome.
Okay.
Well, that was the drunk episode. I think it's a great one.
Well, we gave it another crack. We'll see how we go with it.
Yeah. Otherwise, we might have to revisit it. We'll see. But
right.
Thanks for joining me, Brent, and
Thank
we'll
you.
move on to the next one.
Thank you.
Thank you so much for making it all the way through this episode. After hearing the contents of this podcast, many may realize the sad reality of what has happened to them. If this is you and you seek help or guidance on what to do next, please click the link in the show notes. It'll redirect you to some resources as well as a helpline if you want to talk to someone anonymous. As you'll hear in other episodes, Brent and I do mention how important it is to start talking to someone, whether that's a family member, a friend, or it could be someone anonymous on a helpline. They are trained professionals, and we highly recommend you start this conversation. As you'll hear as well, in no way do you have to report this crime. This is completely up to you, but know that there are resources and links provided in the show notes below should you seek guidance.